Yeah. Welcome back. I hope you have
There will be some small rapid fire rounds. No question though, but it's just your opportunity. And
tough question. Thank you, Annie. This is working well. It's my first time using one of these. I normally use microphones. But thank you, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around and for continuing the conversation. I hope you had good drinks, good conversation, managed to take a break a bit. Hoping that for now, for this panel, we'll get to do a deep dive a bit more, to ask our panelists some more questions, and then honestly open it up for you all to be able to ask more questions as well. And so as Annie said, I'm part of the Digital Ethics and Responsible AI team here at INCA. I work with I.D.E.A. And this topic of human centricity and human-centric technology is extremely close to our hearts, to mine personally. Like, I've dedicated a lot of my career actually in just expanding the so-called tech table to make room for more people to participate in these conversations. So I really appreciate seeing you all late into the evening tonight after a long day of work, still participating and wanting to learn more. So I think we'll kick it off by asking a really simple rapid-fire question, 30 seconds or so. What is the biggest challenge and biggest opportunity you see for human-centric technology? And Tai can kick us off.
Okay. I think, as I mentioned, it's the idea of competition. This is really prevalent in around the inclusion world. Is if we do something for one group, then what about another group? And how does that then create more equity? But really is about how do we pool our resources together to meet the needs of the many. And I go back to that idea of the curb effect, right? Because if we are designing for starting with people with disabilities, there's in fact a billion people, 15% of the world are people with disabilities. And every one of us, if we age and get to the age of 70, then we will all acquire a disability with age and will live with that disability that we've acquired for 12% of our lives. So it's literally designing for everyone if we are designing for people with disabilities. So it is definitely not a competition, but a win-win.
Emily?
Great. Testing? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yes. Thanks. So I have some notes here as well. I think the biggest challenge is actually humans themselves. We are infallible. Really kind of like, fallible. That's the wrong word. Fallible. Humans themselves, we can only account for, what we know and what we've grown up with. Like, we all have our own subjectivities, and how do you account for everybody's subjectivity, right? Like, it's impossible. And inherently, all modeling is biased as a reason because it's all human created, at least right now. That is, I think, the hugest challenge that we have. And even when we have diversity in groups and in modeling and so forth, you still kind of are left with gaps and holes, and you can't really count for all and all eventualities in the world, for example. But however, I think that's also the biggest opportunity. I think it's kind of like two sides of the same coin, right? And it's possible to create, as we were talking about with blockchain technology and technologies of that kind, modular frameworks and sort of ways that technology can facilitate being able to take on an infinite number of nodes and variables, and therefore we can get to a place where we're able to self-govern and opt-in govern so that we can at least be able to make those choices for ourselves and for humans as opposed to having them imposed, essentially.
For me, I think the biggest challenge and opportunity is how much data or models actually play a role in our daily lives, right? So if I just think about today, like all the sort of things that I've done that were about interaction with data, with algorithms, like online, social, or if at any point data has failed me, and I think today it was only really Google Maps who led me to a wrong address, right? which is annoying, but it's far better than what a lot of people have to deal with. But the fact that we are involved so much with data also opens up a lot of opportunity, right? There's a lot of participation. There's a lot of people who want to have a say and who should have a say, right? So I think there's also a lot of scope for improvement, for building inclusive techs and models.
Well, for both the opportunities and the threats, I think the answer is almost the same. For me, it's proof, right? So all of us in the room almost see the inevitability and the urgency of responding to this crisis of trust, right? There are principles that are out there, but paving the way from a state of principles to a state of operationalization and being able to provide proof for those trust points, whether coming from data, algorithm, embedding it into the culture, we're walking an unpaved path. And here lies the opportunity, is that if we're able to institutionalize digital ethics, trust, and human-centered technology, we're able to prove that, number one, digital ethics is not at odds with innovation or business value, that we're able to include and manifest our values that we say we have into a provable operational points, and we're also able to cultivate a loyal customer base that are able also to give us better data, better interactions with our systems. So proof is really the opportunity and the threat, and we can really be the example, the benchmark of a positive manifestation of these principles that we all agree on.
Totally. And I think trust actually has been a common theme, common topic throughout this whole evening, actually. Starting with Noza talking about trustworthy AI, all the way ending with Web3 and kind of a different form of trust with Emily. And actually, Emily, maybe you can kind of kick us off. Web3 and blockchain is sometimes called like trustless technology. Can you speak more to what that means and the connection with human-centric and making sure these things are good for humans?
Yeah, so I think trust is a fundamental social contract, and we actually naturally grant. I mean, most of us, not all the time, stranger danger, etc. But we most of the time grant this like naturally, right? Like we put our trust in a lot of things that we interact with, and even if we're trying to evaluate it as to whether it's valuable for us or not, trust is a fundamental part of that evaluation. And that's also why it's so sort of nefarious when it's broken. For example, like we were talking about today with Cambridge Analytica and just all the products we use, and Google even, which purport to be objective in some sense. And when that trust is broken, it's terrible. And never mind, like when we talk about, again, governments or institutions that break our trust, like healthcare companies we were talking about earlier as well, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a huge problem, and it's absolutely fundamental to everything that we're doing. Never mind just like modeling or never mind trying to create human-centric technology. It is fundamental to creating this technology. So ironically, I think like being trustless in terms of Web3 and blockchain technology, it is actually the ultimate form of trust, because one of the things that you can't do, like I was saying, humans are fallible, is that trust has to be earned, right, in a lot of senses. And the way you earn that is through interaction, et cetera, and you get to know people, et cetera. But the technology facilitates that for you. So in and of itself, it may not be it may be trustless in and of itself in the sense that it doesn't presume trust, but it facilitates it, and it basically enables people to be able to trust because it is coming from a place that is just, or it is built to be, in the pure sense of the word, objective. And that's the beauty of, yeah, exactly. Like it's completely transparent. It's designed to be that way, and therefore there's no sort of doubt in its integrity, and there's no there's no black box that you have to kind of break open to figure out, if your trust is being earned or misused and so forth. So by being trustless, it is actually facilitating the most trust.
Well, I actually wanted to follow up with that with Soraya, actually, because Soraya is like you're hands-on, like doing this every day with Carra, and trying to really embed and integrate all the kind of the Carra approach that you mentioned in your talk. Can you be more specific and tell us like how your team is actually embedding that trust and that human centricity in your day-to-day work?
Sure. So I think obviously as a startup, right, we're kind of very dependent on customer feedback and the customer being happy with what we provide, right? So for us, the sort of feedback, co-creation with the customer is very key. As we're now developing a new feature, first of all, it's kind of actually talking to the customer, right? Understanding their problems. What are they actually trying to do? What would be useful for them? Which sort of advice, which sort of personalization and recommendations is useful for them? And like in that context, for example, we've done a range of customer interviews, and it's always interesting to kind of hear their perspective, see what are they dealing with. Obviously, I myself, I have curly hair, but there are totally different types of curls, different styles, and so on. So hearing these different perspectives, hearing what is the background for the user, what is actually the sort of impact for them, right? Mm-hmm. For us, it might just be like ultimately a conversion, a user number, a transaction or something. But for them, there's like a whole different story. Like with hair, there's always a history behind it. There's a journey that people have taken. It's very personal. So you want to make sure that you provide them with a good service. And for us, this is also just so intrinsic because if they're not happy, they won't recommend us. Ultimately, we don't progress, right? So for I guess for startups, very often this is very much aligned with the user objective is very much aligned with the company objectives, which is a bit of a advantage. And then from a data perspective, it is actually just building up this sort of data set, and that's as always not easy because it's about finding the sort of data sources, building up the data set, understanding the data. It's always just spending so much time on piecing together the different pieces of information, understanding what's in there, understanding what could be potentially problems of this as we acquire retailer data, reviews data, social media data. For example, as I'm looking into what are different people with different hair textures say about different products, I, for example, realized that for specific textures we just have less data because people talk about it less, right? So then there's a question, what do I do about it? Do I just say, okay, there's less available, we have to work with that? Or do I go to other sources? Do I try to find other sources? Do I try to invite the customers to actively give us more feedback? So it's all about kind of building a strong foundation for us to ultimately be able to serve the customer and make sure that this is also aligned with sort of customer value or customer providing value for the customer is also aligned with our sort of business objectives, I would say.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you're really putting into practice what it means to build inclusive technology. And as you said, your team found this opportunity, and you've gone for it, and you're making money out of it, which is amazing. And you're setting in like a new precedent for how it can be done. Ty, I guess following up on that and connected to that, how does a big company like IKEA that is, trying to be more inclusive and accessible, how do we, I guess, how are we able to find these like really interesting solutions and are able to scale them, even though we start off with smaller, for smaller communities? How do we scale them across the company, or how does a big company like IKEA impact these communities?
Yeah, scaling. That's an interesting question because for us it's definitely not an easy thing to do. But for us and how we're working as a center of expertise is around how do we enable those that we're working with to scale this up themselves, right? So our team is a multidisciplinary team of various backgrounds, whether design to engineering to folks in change management. And the idea idea is to build that strategy, build those tools, build those guidelines, and then come into the teams, our product teams and other stakeholders, to then support in that process so that then we democratize that, right? Because certainly our team is not going to go in everywhere in the company to build accessibility or build inclusion, because then it just sits with us. That doesn't create actual scalability and doesn't create the transformation we need. So we have to go out there and ensure that that is built from within.
Yeah. And I guess like we're your counterparts. So Abda and I work for Digital Ethics, Responsible AI. And you know, Abda and I probably have, in some ways, a similar passion, different backgrounds, right? You'd say. From your perspective, how are you seeing us as a team or as IKEA saying we don't want to just do ethics washing? You know, we don't want to just like talk all these things. We want to actually put it into practice. What's your take on it?
Well, really asking me the hard question.
Not biased.
Yeah, but ethics washing is a really good point, right? Because if you do what we talked about first, is that you start from principles and you state them and you're very vocal about them, but then there is really no proof points at the end of the day. You're not building the foundational efforts that enables you to act on these proof points. So we need to put ourselves in a place where we don't have to rely on goodwill or specific initiatives to be just. It's not one test that you have to do. It's not one tool that you have to deploy. What we have to really do is cultivate a holistic understanding of what digital ethics is. That means starting from data, understanding data flows, understanding consent, understanding where the data goes in terms of algorithms, decision-making, AI, understanding the governance structures that control these things, also understanding the design patterns that then expose these things to the user, and then embedding that ethical knowledge, that responsible knowledge, into the everyday life of almost every single team. And you can't do this alone. And above all of this, you need to expose your efforts in a way that is measurable, right? So that way, when you say, you walk the talk, that you say, I have these principles and I've manifested them in these ways. In a way to also, you're building the structure to enable trust as well, right? You're not relying on a person's judgment to be like, oh yeah, this is ethical, this is not. Right? So at the end of the day, what you're trying to create is a shared choreography that is a foundational effort in the company. So at the end, we're not relying on goodwill, and then we can really prove that we are being as ethical, responsible as we can. We get the feedback when we need to. It's not a one-shot kind of situation. It's an iterative system that is trying to act on the principles that we've set.
Yeah, it's harder to prove that we're doing good, and it's easier to see when the company's not doing bad, and it's easier to prove that actually it's really valuable to do good, and really quantifying that. I want to open it up a little bit for you all. What other questions did you have, or what do you want to ask our panelists here that you want to cover? Yeah.
Privacy. I think we take for granted that the data that we work with has already been taken care of in terms of the integrity of user data. But so I was wondering if I want to start initiating these conversations with my team, like what are good tips or strategies for keeping this top of mind, and say like let's start considering this from now on.
Yeah, that's a great question. Who wants to take?
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah.
So I would say ultimately anything that's not a metric or a KPI won't really be as much, let's say, prioritized. So I think deciding to kind of put this as such, somehow integrate this as such in your objectives, a metric for understanding what it means for various subgroups, or KPIs for inclusivity, which could be providing value for different consumer groups or something like that, or actively collecting feedback from consumers, right, from end users to understand this, to kind of close the loop. I think that this is a good starting point, and then this can lead to exploring well, how does this propagate across the sort of workflow across the machine learning pipeline, right? So if I want to make sure that any sort of presentation or recommendations are benefiting a large area of users or diverse user groups, and if there's a metric for me, then I need to kind of start looking, okay, what is the current status, right? How can I measure it again, right? How can I see that? And then if I have a measurement, how can I improve that, right? Is it the data? Is it the model? Is it the communication? Is it how we use, right? And then kind of, following that through.
Abdul, do you want to cover anything as well?
Not in particular. I think.
Okay.
No, I think it's a really good point about really finding KPIs and being quite transparent about what KPIs we're measuring. So if we're doing cell population analysis after deployment, or are we debiasing the data before it gets into the model, for example. And in a way, you kind of have to segment the problem into a tangible KPI, which is, again, not the holistic understanding of where it could be that the AI itself is not fit for purpose. And there needs to be a control system. Sometimes the best AI is the one you don't deploy, but a lot of the times it is.
Yeah.
And it's kind of really understanding, where should we intervene? And it's almost the same point as turning into something tangible for them to play with.
I think another problem is that as data scientists, we often, of course, focus on a lot of the quantitative data that we have, but there is a large body, and especially when I was in marketing analytics and marketing data science, of qualitative data that you can also integrate. It's a lot harder, though. This is why we try to, we just shy away from it. Oh God, do you have to do an NLP model on top of everything else that you're doing? Sometimes, sometimes that is the answer, and that is also a way to bring in some elements that the more human element of model building and so forth, and that a lot of old school, I want to say, data directors and data scientists would shy away from that because it's not as quantifiable as pure numbers, of course, but that is also its value, right, in and of itself. So I think that's also an answer that you can also start to integrate into all your processes as work streams.
Yeah, I can add 2 cents. Sorry, it's supposed to come back. Stop. Yeah. And one of the things that indeed what you said, and very much resonating what you're saying, traceability of data, right? So we need to understand what's the state of the data based on certain aspect, KPIs, but human centricity is also about, so for us, human centricity is also about what really we are contributing towards business, which is business requirement. So do we know that, can we trace what is that specific business purpose that we are literally solving by building something through our pipeline or through our model? So how do we establish and keep track of what's happening? That also helps with the accountability, data quality, especially when we see something going wrong, we need to also find out who should solve it, right? So measurability gives us the way of observability towards, what's happening. It's like the lens towards what's happening, and traceability will give us the idea, why, who is using it, for what purpose, what kind of algorithm, what Noza also mentioned, right? So there are certain aspects that we definitely need to focus on, Sorry.
It's all good, Annie. Yeah.
My name is Chi. I'm also a software engineer at IKEA, especially on the IKEA app. And I think the discussion tonight has a lot of focus on data and then the models. And as a software engineer, I'm also very interested to understand what role can a software engineer, play, because we don't necessarily really understand, model, what is a just model, what is not. But as a counterpart, in building the just and trustworthy technology, how can we do better in this journey?
I would actually say that maybe because you're not directly working on the data, you actually have a very valid and good viewpoint on it, right? So I think first of all, I'm aiming to understand what's going on, right? So the data scientist, the person working on the model, should be able to explain what is going on, any limitations, right? And then if you, as someone who has not been involved in the data, who has not been working on the model, you might already see a lot of things that are really like, okay, really? Is this how it's working? Is this the sort of input that we're using? And then also connecting to the sort of deployment and how models or data or technology is used, right? So you might even be kind of a step closer to the user than the data scientist is, right? So I know usually from working in larger businesses, working on the data sometimes means that you kind of develop the model and then you hand it over to someone to deploy it, and they might actually see what is the sort of usage from the user, right? So as you measure, for example, how is the model used, how is it kind of called, right? Is this and providing that feedback back to the model is as in kind of, maybe we think initially our model is usually, I don't know, accessed from, like, or some software is accessed from mobile or from desktop, right? I remember like this was quite often discussion, mobile versus desktop, right? It used to be that everyone developed for desktop, and then people found out, oh no, people are using their mobiles, right? And a lot of things didn't kind of translate. And then now we went through a pandemic, everyone is at home again, back to desktop, right? So actually kind of seeing this sort of interaction between the user and the model might actually also be some, like, a very good point, something that you have closer access to. But I think exactly building this sort of context and not just having like the sort of siloed approaches and not just leaving the algorithm and the model for the data scientist, but if I as a data scientist can't communicate to you what my model does and what the limitations are, then we already have a problem, right? Because then it is already not kind of clear, it is not probably, it probably is not inclusive to begin with.
Yeah, I think as a builder, I think you actually have probably more agency in some sense than even data models and data scientists, just because, yeah, like Soraya was saying, you're closer to the product and you are, essentially like the one who is having more direct contact with the end user than someone on the side of the gathering information side. And I think Ty, like you alluded to in your talk about designing for different types of usage, and I think there's a lot that you can do there, even in suggesting, for example, I don't know how exactly you work at IKEA anymore. I used to work here, but anyway, but for example, if you have close contact with your product managers, or if you have just like abilities to kind of surface those sorts of ideas, I think there's a lot of power that you have there to be able to, directly just test things. And you don't even need data in some sense to be able to do that. I mean, you do need to measure in some sense, but like you can kind of go ahead and do those things without necessarily having to have someone to say, oh, this is a model that we know has proven to work. Because some of the things that I think one of the things that happen in data is that you do kind of get into a bit of a trap of like not doing things that the data doesn't say that you should do. But if we think about like the things that happen, or like, testing, check. If you think about, for example, like the iPhone, there's a story about Steve Jobs, how he created this thing and people were like, oh, what? No one's going to want that. But he built it anyway. And he obviously, I mean, he's a particular kind of person, but that just goes to show that sometimes the data is observability, right? It's observing what's already happened. It doesn't tell what's in the future. And so there's a lot that you can do there, I think.
Is there any advice or guidance you'd provide from your perspective, especially like accessible interfaces?
Yeah, for me, it's really around changing the ways that we work. How do we break down the silos? How do we work together end to end? Because coming from the digital experience world where we're not necessarily included in the beginning process. And similarly, right, when we're looking at experts from all the different disciplines, how do we start and have those conversations and understand how we're working together and right, so that it's a lot less waterfall in general. And then we're not creating pieces and handing it off, right?
Yeah.
I have a question. Okay, fine. I can try without it, and maybe you can repeat if you don't hear it.
Yeah.
Now a lot of thoughts. You mentioned about the not looking at data, Emily. Not only looking at data. So I was actually wondering. Often we always talk about data-driven. So we only look at data, numbers. But in the end, the core, the end user is us, which is humans. So I'm very interested to hear about at what points do you start bringing in, let's say, UX designers who has thinking it from a very user experience from different levels, and I want to, and I don't have a background in ethics and in data, but I would love to hear how do you see the approach of bringing that in, at what level, and also how that could affect maybe, as Ty mentioned, removing and working in silos, right? Like, how can you bring in different elements to co-create, also another word I really like, and if that's already done in IKEA, for example, maybe that's why it's going as well, or yeah, if you can share a little bit from your aspects.
That's a great question. I think Abdo should take this one. You can explain why.
Okay, so just to rephrase, this is a question about the role of design.
I think that was part of it. That's why I was trying to figure out how I can phrase it. I think it started with data-driven. You cannot only just look at data and make the data decisions. So you need to include the human aspect, which becomes more data-informed, whatever it might be. And how do you make that? Like, the data-informed part is having a human. Where to get that from, that human aspect of things. For example, I think that would be from the design part of how you design the process.
Well, the short answer is that the human element, or being human-centric, as we say, comes at all the stages, right? Is that from the design phase, you're involving everyone, you're bringing in all the relevant stakeholders. Is that during development, you're taking into account all the user needs. From deployment side, you're having these feedback mechanisms of the user. So you're allowing for people to report. You're allowing space for dissent. So if people feel harmed by whatever you've deployed, they have a way to say it. And the role of UX is very, very complementary in that sense, because you have, let's say, a robust, trustworthy system. The technology is there. It is measurable, observable in a perfect world. The final layer in which the user gets exposed to that technology is through the user interaction. So we see a lot of examples of like dark patterns, for example, that even if you have a consent mechanism, it's hidden somewhere in the corner of a website. Or you see very clean technology, but very computationally intensive interfaces that contribute to the footprint, the carbon footprint. So in that case, the role of UX is, first of all, to work together with that human-centric technology. So there's human-centric design at the end of the process. But then you also allow for users to give the feedback mechanism, to speak back to kind of the machine or the algorithm. So as a way to include them not once, not in the middle, but iteratively and systematically include the voices of the people. It could be a thumbs up button on a recommendation. It could be as simple as that, but it could also be a little bit more complex.
And I want to actually expand this idea of like human, actually related. And this is actually related to a conversation I was having with a colleague during the break, and this is around sustainability, actually. So not only as an individual and humans, but actually as for our planet, like how can these technologies be good for us? And Emily, you had mentioned in your presentation that Web3 is inherently an inclusive technology. And so the question, around sustainability that I wanted to ask you is you said inherently to have value, like you have to consume energy. And I wanted you to expand a bit more on that, because when I heard you say that, I heard you say actually consumption of energy is power, which actually seems almost antithesis to what you're talking about. And then also we know that with an increased carbon footprint, that the communities that are going to be most affected are going to be the marginalized ones, the most developing countries. And we're seeing this already with climate change and, countries asking for reparations from the West almost because they're suffering the negative impact. Can you speak more to sustainability and what you were talking about? And I'm sorry, that was a question.
Yeah, so I haven't actually really thought about that from sustainability point of view. I think as we were saying before, it is a problem in some sense because it is kind of it is a problem in a lot of ways, but I think mainly because of the way that we generate energy right now is the way that we generate energy right now, which is like fossil fuels and so forth. So I think ideally, and this is perhaps maybe a little bit too idealistic of me, is that we move like in step towards a world in which we're taking into account, you know, the fact that we need energy. Like there's no world in which we don't need energy, right? And also moving towards technologies that allow us to have it allows us to be more sustainable in a lot of ways. So this is kind of like an easy way out. I mean, you can tell I haven't really thought that hard about it. But I think like we were talking at the break about like just a fundamental paradigm shift, and I think that's one thing that I have faith in. And it's a terrible answer, I know, but I do have faith that we are moving towards a world in which things are going to get better. I mean, it doesn't seem like that right now, don't get me wrong, but I do believe in energy as a whole and in terms of entropy. And so this is like getting really philosophical. Bear with me. But in terms of like entropy, and so like the world is always kind of losing energy, right? Like it's always going outwards in some sense. And as humans, we've been really good at reining it in, actually, and we've been really good at making sense out of chaos in a lot of ways. And the natural way of the world is just chaos. That's just how it is. But because we have moved so well, actually, throughout history to get to this place where we are at, I truly believe that we will reach a point in society, I suppose, or history, in which we will have, for all intents and purposes, all our shit together. So like, and by that I mean that we are working on these things and these hard problems of energy and sustainability and renewable resources, and I think that will be in step with something like, it can be in step rather with blockchain and Web3. It's not mutually exclusive. I think there's also a world in which there's a theory actually from a guy who works for Space Force, which is a real thing, by the way. I didn't really know until that I saw his interview. And his theory, which is super interesting, is that Bitcoin is sort of a mutual weapon, which is taking it into a negative space, don't get me wrong, but again, bear with me here, where everyone's going to be trying to mine and trying to use energy for mining and to gain value for themselves and for their societies. As a result, though, what happens is that we're going to be at a sort of war, but it will be a mutually constructive war. That is counter to what we have so far, right? All the world wars we've had so far, every war has been kinetic in the sense we've gone out and fought, and we've gone out and lost energy through humans, right? And we've lost humans as well, and it has been mutually destructive. In order to invade a country, you need to destroy. But the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, you're coming to a place where you are using energy and you have a vested interest in sustaining the world through your resources, because if you destroy the thing that you're going for, you destroy everyone else as well, and yourself. So that's a very complex answer, I recognize.
To a softball question.
Yeah, it's a very, and that's I think like again a paradigm shift that we need to move into, and it's a bit far removed, but come talk to me afterwards if you want to know more.
Yeah, thank you.
Can
I
I?
appreciate that. Yeah.
I think the opportunities that Web 3.0 brings to the table are really exciting, but then I also want to peg the question of sustainability a little bit. One reason I think it's so difficult to talk about sometimes is that we're so detached from the systems that consume energy around us, right? So I don't know how many of us are aware that when you log into a platform online on your phone, where does the data travel, right? We don't know. We don't know how many countries, how many borders it crossed, how many power lines it had to consume. We're not aware of our digital behavior, how much carbon footprint it exerts. So I think for a company in the scale of IKEA, there are small wins. Maybe we don't need a paradigm shift. So if we talk about visibility, if we talk about understanding what data we consume, where does it go, where does it move, and for how long do we need to keep it, already we can make, because small things add up, we can make a monumental decrease in our energy consumption. So I think visibility and connecting kind of the source of energy or the consumption of energy to the actual systems that use it. And maybe this is not the fault of the user. You shouldn't worry as a user, okay, how much is my login costing? But as a person developing the energy, as a person making design decisions, human centricity also means understanding the environmental footprint, because it's going to come back. And you made a really nice connection between marginalized, disproportionate effect between technology's carbon footprint, environmental agency, and communities that are marginalized.
Yeah, it's all connected, like humanity. There was one question, I know I kind of like stuck in line, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I have one question and one half thought. So I'll ask the question, but I'll give you context. So I'm a software engineer, but I'm like I'm like playing with technology ideas mostly because I care about my sister and she happens to be a mom. So I'm interested in working on things related to her, and it seems like that might be related to other people. I am not a mom, and I know that even if I was a mom, I would represent like a really tiny fraction, very individual perspective on what that would be like. So if I wanted to talk to people about it and understand their experiences, and work on this thing for my sister, so it wasn't just for my sister, what would be, like, do you as product designers and who are working on things regarding respecting everybody's experiences, do you have thoughts or advice on how you can respect the experiences of people you're talking to who have different experiences from you?
That was a good question. Ty, do you want to take it?
For me, I think one of the key things is around having that dialogue, right? And how do you involve people in the decisions? One of the challenges we have is that, right, this concept in the disability community, where we talk about never for us without us, right, is then how do we give historically underrepresented people the ability to actually make the decisions so that they're the ones leading and creating that? And then how do we, as we work on products, always engage with a diverse group of people, which means testing. So if it's the one takeaway to coming out of here is any of you that's working on products or services, as you are designing that, making those decisions, right, are these people involved? And are you testing that product along the way and seeing how that can be improved? Because much of the time, there's not enough invested in those diverse perspectives to actually know if you're going the right direction. Right?
Soraya.
Yeah, if you can just add to that. So I think just basically broadening up the scope, right? Kind of asking people, several people who are not directly maybe involved in creating the product. So I remember when I was working at ASOS, initially before we actually launched recommendations, we did a user study, and where we just wanted to test whether our algorithm version A is better than what we currently have on the website. So we built a website for that. We had two side-by-side versions of the recommendations, and we asked users to kind of rate them. And then there was like an open text feedback form, right? And basically we just wanted to collect this, okay, well, what I wanted to see at the end was obviously that my algorithm was better than what we currently have, and it marginally was. But what was most insightful actually for them was this sort of open text feedback form, right? And it was just kind of one box where we asked, okay, give us any feedback. And that feedback that we got was so valuable that it basically filled like a product roadmap for the next years in terms of what we actually need to pay attention to, right? So just having these sort of maybe open questions, and I think quite often companies do that in the beginning when they're actually starting out, because then you're still finding your way, and then later on as you're already kind of making money, you kind of things are working. A lot of companies stop doing that, right? Stop having these sort of active interactions with the users or with other stakeholders. And I think just if you ask users what do they think, they will just open up, right? Not everyone will, but by just opening it up to different perspectives, you can start to kind of collect different signals, and then maybe you see one mom saying, oh, this doesn't work for me because X, Y, Z, and then you say, okay, maybe this is a problem for all moms, right? So maybe we can reach out to people who are mothers, and some will have a problem with it, some won't, right? But just kind of, yeah, I think just leaving this very open, this sort of what works, what doesn't work for you, why, or what are expectations. I think these are really very simple, powerful questions that open up the dialogue. And obviously this is for end user focused applications. It is a bit more tricky if you're doing things that are let's say, more business to business, but then you maybe have to kind of go a step further to understand how your product impacts users.
We're almost at time. Thank you for staying and for asking these amazing questions. Maybe I'll ask one final question for you all, which won't be hard. Emily, no. So we have a really wide variety of people here, people who are working in tech, people who probably want to enter tech, people who just are interested consumers. What are 2 next steps that people can take from your perspective to advance, to advocate for human-centric technology? And Abdi, you can go first and we can go in order.
One step is literacy. I mean, literacy is multiple steps, but literacy of the space that you have to engage with these topics, right? So kind of attending a talk like this one is level 0 of understanding what you can do, moving into operational knowledge at some point. So what tools can I use as a software engineer, as a data scientist, or as a designer, right? The second one is to be active, right? Is to be an activist, is that when you see something, you have ideas, you report it to whatever structure you have there, whatever diversity team, whatever digital ethics team you have there, and to be active in providing that feedback mechanism. Because I don't feel anyone here in this panel wants to work alone. We all want to orchestrate a movement. And to do that, you need kind of the whole shared choreography aspect of it. So these are the 2 things.
Yeah, you already took some points. But I would say, yeah, also just communication, education. So I think just as you have an insight in what other types of organization the business does in your companies, then just providing maybe feedbacks into that, seeing if people are open to discuss, and also actively collect that sort of feedback, I think. Already kind of in your immediate circle, right? You probably have diverse viewpoints, and that's a good starting point, and then to take it maybe outside of the company or so.
Yeah, they don't really have. This is a much easier question, by the way. Yeah, I think that it's pretty much all the points that have already been brought up. I think advocacy for self as well as for others is also super important. By that I mean sort of like being aware of your own position, being aware of the others, and making sure that you're bridging those gaps wherever possible. Also speaking up. I think especially in a diverse crowd, it can be really, really hard sometimes in some circumstances to speak up, and that's also part of advocacy, is to really say like, hey, I think this is a problem, or how we thought about this and so forth, and really just bringing those things to the surface. I think if we all stay quiet, like we'll never go anywhere.
I would say inclusion always starts with the self, so creating that awareness for self, which is starting with experiencing exclusion as a noticing exclusion around your day-to-day to your services and products. Like for example, moving to the Netherlands, this is the land of giants, right? The biggest, tallest people in the world. Most chairs just do not fit me at all here, and is very uncomfortable. Mirrors are like up here. I don't even see the top of my head, right? These simple little things you notice, and you notice your loved ones, what they're struggling with. Then you start thinking about, okay, then we've left some people out here in this right process. And then you carry it into work, that how are you going to test with more people so you can get their experiences? And then finally, I'll say create that awareness, because if you haven't heard by now of the European Accessibility Act, this will require all companies that have any kind of external-facing digital product or service of some kind to be digitally accessible. So if your company or your product team or your team is not working on that already, then you're behind, and that has to happen, and that starts with just like, hey, this is happening by 2025, whether we like it or not. So we need to start changing now.
Yeah, totally. And we really appreciate all the perspectives and insights that you shared tonight. There's this professor. She's called Professor Fei-Fei Li. She's the director of the Stanford Center for Human-Centered AI, and she often says, she's got this, I'm paraphrasing the quote here, but she often says that and she talks about AI, but I think this relates to, like, I think across everyone's perspectives, that we talk about artificial AI, but there's nothing artificial about it. It's inspired by humans, created by humans, and it impacts humans. And I think, like, tonight, we really kind of dove deeper into what that meant from your perspectives. And I think it takes all of us. And I think this is, you could call it stage 1 or level 1, level 0. It doesn't really matter. Like, the fact that you all are here tonight and wanting to learn more is really the first step. So thank you. And please join me in thanking these amazing panelists for their advice and their thoughts tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Ty, Emily, Soraya, Abdul, and Tanya. You've been amazing. Thank you, audience, for staying through this and listening, and for being here. Like Tanya said, this is step 1. The fact that you're all here and are interested in the topic already says great things. Thank you, IKEA, who helped organize this, and in particular, this has been great. I know that I think the office is open for very short amount of time. So if you've got time to, like, quickly get contact details from anyone or ask your final questions, please do. Please, would you take a couple of minutes, and if you can't from where you're sitting, otherwise come up and scan the barcode. We hope to be hosting a lot more events like this, and your feedback means everything to us to understand what's important to you, what works, what doesn't work. This is data. Data is information. We need your data. That's what we're going with. Human-centric data, yes. Okay, so that's all. Thank you so much. I've heard so many interesting things tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.